Kimi Code hits 80.2% on SWE bench verified, while Ollama has 0 published benchmark scores, and that gap could cost you weeks of debugging if you pick wrong. $0 versus $19 a month. Local AI coding tools are exploding right now, so I'm putting Ollama against Kimi Code across 5 head-to-head tests to see which workflow actually wins. One user burned through Kimi Code's $90 subscription in 4 days flat. And whether that's your problem or not comes down to one thing we haven't answered yet. My name is Brian, and I'm in these tools 12 hours a day, so you don't have to be. And every number here is traced back to official pricing pages, model cards, and docs both companies actually publish. This is for developers running real coding workloads who need to know if free local beats a 19-hour-a-month cloud agent. Test 1, cost. The concrete failure mode you want to avoid is this. You spin up a cloud coding agent, you're shipping features fast, and then your $99 monthly subscription's gone in 4 days because the token limits are brutal, and that's a real thing that happened to real Kimi Code users. So knowing the true cost structure before you commit saves you that pain. I went through the actual pricing pages, and here's what I found. Ollama's local software is free forever, $0 a month, no per token fees, and Kimi Code starts at $19 a month. For the Moderato tier, goes to $39 for Allegretto and $99 for Allegro. And what surprised me is the API is billed separately on top of that, with $1 minimum just to activate. Now the gap is smaller than it looks once you count hardware, because Ollama is free to run, but you need a GPU rig that costs anywhere from $2,000 to $40,000 or more upfront. And Kimi's subscription bundles the full agent setup, not just the model weights, so it really depends on whether you already own the hardware or you're starting from scratch. Ollama takes cost, and the hardware overhead does eat into the advantage a bit. But if you've already got a decent GPU, the ongoing difference is massive. 0 per month versus $19 to $9 per month is a real gap when you're running this daily, and that puts Ollama up 1-0 on the scoreboard. Test 2, coding benchmark performance. A solo developer shipping a production feature on a deadline needs to know if the model they're running can actually close real GitHub issues, not just autocomplete lines. And SWE Bench Verified is the standard test for that, because it throws real-world software engineering tasks at a model and checks if it solves them end-to-end. So the score you get here tells you a lot about whether you can trust the tool on hard work. The published data is pretty one-sided. Kimi Code K2.6 scores 80.2% on SWE Bench Verified and 58.6% on SWE Bench Pro. K2.7 hits 62.0 on Kimi Code Bench V2, and Ollama as a runner has no published figure at all because the score depends entirely on which model you load into it. So the on-screen cards show question marks on Ollama's side for every single benchmark row. That said, the gap isn't as clean as those scores make it look, because community reports say local 70B models running through Ollama handle 70 to 80% of everyday coding tasks, about as well as GPT-4o on a 24 GB GPU, and I'd take that with a grain of salt since it's unverified community data. But it does mean Ollama isn't a blank slate, and the missing numbers just make a direct comparison really hard to call with confidence. Kimi Code takes this one because the 80.2% SWE Bench Verified score is a real verifiable number, and Ollama simply can't put anything comparable on the table, and community data doesn't close that gap when you need to make a real decision. So that ties it up 1-1. Test 3, speed. The number that caught my eye right away is 180 tokens per second on Kimi Code's high-speed tier, up to 260 on short context. And if you're literally hammering a coding agent all day, waiting on slow output kills your flow and adds up to real lost time across a week of work. I tracked down every speed figure I could find, and here's where it gets complicated. Ollama clocks 112 tokens per second on an M4 Max Mac using the MLX backend, plus a prefill speed of 1,110 tokens per second on that same chip. Kimi Code's standard tier runs 100 tokens per second, and the high-speed tier hits around 180. But bear in mind these are completely different hardware setups, local Mac chip versus cloud server. Comparing these two speed numbers is kind of apples to oranges, because Ollama's 112 tokens per second is specific to an M4 Max Mac, With the MLX backend turned on and most people aren't running that exact setup, Kimi's 180 tokens per second is vendor claimed and not independently verified. And if you're on a mid-range GPU, your Ollama speeds could be way lower than 112. So the real-world gap depends almost entirely on your hardware. Speed is a tie, and the setups are just too different to call a winner honestly. Ollama on an M4 Max is fast, but that's not most people's rig, and Kimi's high-speed numbers are vendor-claimed, so no change to the score. Alright, so we're tied 1-1 with one test called a draw, and the next two tests cover context limits and deployment flexibility. And those two dimensions are where the real cost of ownership story gets decided, because if you're running long coding sessions with huge code bases, context limits could flip the entire value calculations we just ran on price. Test 4. Context and output limits. The day your tool truncates a 50,000 line codebase mid-session, you lose the whole refactor and start over. And context window size determines how much of your project the model can actually see at once. So if it's too small, you're constantly re-explaining your own code to the agent, which is slow and expensive. Both tools technically offer large context, but the way you get there is completely different. Kimi Code K2.7 gives you a flat 262 which in 44 tokens, no matter what. While Ollama's context window is VRAM dependent, 4K tokens on most consumer GPUs under 24 GB, 32K on 24 to 48 GB, and 256K only if you've got 48 GB or more of VRAM. So the on-screen cards show Kimi's number as fixed while Ollama's bar grows with your hardware. If you've got 48 GB of VRAM, Ollama's 256K context is basically neck and neck with Kimi's 262K, and the gap is tiny at the top end, but most people are not running 48 GB consumer rigs, so if you're on a standard 12 GB or 16 GB GPU, you're stuck at 4K context with Ollama, and that's a pretty painful limitation for serious coding work. Context is another tie. If you've got the right hardware, Ollama gets to 256K and basically matches Kimi's 262K, and for most people on standard GPUs, Kimi wins this in practice. But since the data doesn't let us call a clean winner, the score stays the same. Test 5. Deployment and modality. Say you've got a client with a strict data policy, no code leaves the building, no exceptions, or you're working on something proprietary and you just don't want your code base touching a cloud server. And that's where deployment flexibility stops being a nice to have and becomes the whole decision, because one of these tools handles that situation and one of them doesn't. The difference here is pretty stark. Ollama runs fully local, so your code never leaves your machine. It's never logged, never trained on, and it supports 135,000 plus GGUF models with 40,000 plus community integrations, while Kimi Code is cloud only for the agent side, but it plugs directly into Claude Code, OpenCode, and Codex, which is a genuinely big workflow unlock if you're already in that ecosystem. Ollama takes deployment, and Kimi's Claude Code integration does make this closer than you'd think for a lot of workflows. But 135,000 plus models, full local control, and zero data leaving your machine is a wider advantage than any single integration can match, which moves the overall score to Ollama 2, Kimi Code 1 with 2 tests tied. Ollama wins on cost, privacy, and model choice. It's free to run locally with no per-token fees. Your code stays on your machine and is never logged or trained on. And you get access to 135,000 plus models, so you're not locked into one vendor's stack. And if you've got 48 GB of VRAM, your context window hits 256K and nearly matches Kimi's flat rate. Kimi Code wins on verifiable performance, consistent context, and integration. It's the only one with published benchmark scores you can actually check at 80.2% on SWE Bench Verified. It gives you a flat 262K context window, regardless of your hardware. And it plugs directly into Claude Code, OpenCode, and Codex right out of the box, which is a massive time saver if you're already in those workflows. So here's the decision rule. If you've got a decent GPU, care about privacy, and want zero ongoing cost, Ollama is your pick because free forever beats $19 a month. Every month, and if you want a coding agent with an 80.2% SWE bench score, consistent 262K context, and Claude Code integration out of the box, Kimi Code is worth the subscription. So it really comes down to one thing. Do you want to own your stack or rent the best agent? If you're already leaning toward Ollama, but wondering how it stacks up against a dedicated coding agent in a real workflow, I ran that exact comparison, and it's up next. Ollama versus Claude Code can free local keep up. And the results were a lot closer than I thought going in, and there's one specific test where local surprised me.